You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. As always, I am your host, Danny Ashes. I'm here with my co-host, Trey, and our guest for this episode, Sanctus Manium. Sanctus Manium is a death doula, a dominatrix, a drag queen, and an artist, among many other trades. I'm grateful to have them with us on this episode to discuss the most universally personal metaphysical experience, that being death. Now, we've covered death every year at the end of the year for this will be the 4th year, and we've spoken with Caitlin Doty, we've spoken with Bess Lovejoy, and we've spoken with Lauren Rhodes, all of which who have their own sort of specialty within the sphere of work that encompasses mortality and dying. Not to mention we've talked about death as a topic since the beginning of this podcast. On this episode, however, we're going to be focusing on the fear of death, a emotion that is often accompanied by the inevitable confrontation with a finite existence and the existential crisis that can accompany that confrontation. I think it is prudent to offer a content warning at the beginning of this episode, as we will be discussing issues of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, experiences of meaninglessness, death, suffering, and psychological trauma. While we are going to explore these topics from an honest, open perspective, I'm also going to strive to offer ways in which we can manage and even find contentment and actualization in relation to these fundamental experiences of reality. So, Sanctus, thank you again for joining us today. Let's begin where we always do. Tell us a bit about your long, dark road into the goth subculture.
Okay, so I need to give a disclaimer here. I am in no way saying that I am gothier than thou, or I am more goth or more valid than any other goths. That's a common accusation I get. But I was born into the subculture. My parents were both part of the original House of Usher scene in California before it moved to San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
It was in Berkeley. And that's like where bands like, Kill Sister Kill and Malign came from. So I had the privilege of having goth parents, and, like my first concert was ever the Creatures during their
nice.
Animus tour. Yeah, I got to see them at the Maritime in San Francisco. I was 7 years old because I remember that same year Roz Williams died, and all the grown-ups thought it was like a joke at first, and then the next day everyone was really sad. So it was definitely the same year. So yeah, I would have been 7 years old going on 8 years old. But yeah, that's kind of how that's how I got into it. It's thanks to my parents. Yeah.
That is incredible. So then the other relevant bit of introduction here is how you got into work as a death doula and where that started for you.
I was born ill, like chronically ill. So I've always had a really close relationship with my mortality. And then having goth parents, you're surrounded by people. Like back in the 90s, there were more about the whole death thing. I think lately people are kind of more fearful, like this generation, this younger generation. But yeah, I had to face my mortality a lot, and I spent a lot of time in the hospital. I witnessed a lot of children actually die in the hospital that I stayed at. And as I aged, I just, instead of becoming fearful of it, I just sort of became obsessed with it for some reason. And I thought, well, maybe I can turn this obsession into a career. At first, I wanted to be a mortician, but then the more I learned about mortuary science, the less I agreed with it. It's not a great, it's just so much. There's so much that goes into it. And it's just, there's a lot of ethical issues that I do not agree with, like embalming. Like technically I know how to embalm, but I don't like it. I don't agree with it. Like sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's really just, it's an outmoded practice since we've invented refrigeration at this point.
Yeah, there's just so many things you can do with your body when you die. You can even turn yourself into a record and put your favorite songs on those records for people to play. So it's like, why would I go with embalming when it's so bad for the environment? And I know like just one person fighting these environmental issues isn't going to do much, but you had like Kate and Dodie on your show before, and I agree with a lot of what she says actually when it comes to more ethical burials. I dealt with a lot of, I don't know if I need to put a trigger warning or not here for like suicidal ideation, but because of my illnesses, I was in a lot of pain. So I did grow up with a lot of suicidal ideation. I deal with I don't know how to put it, but I am diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features and ADHD. So it's like a constant battle with my head to, just stay alive. And which is why I have 28 rats right now, and just taking care of rats and my cats, and just taking care of others makes staying alive compulsory for me. So when I was 20, I'm in my 30s now, I found out about death midwifery from a book, and I do not recall the name of the book. It was an old book, but I became very interested in it. And for some reason, in the past 4 years, it's gotten a lot more popular than it used to be. But yeah, I felt like I could turn this weird obsession I have with my own mortality into something better than myself, something I could focus on instead of focusing on my mortality. I can help others who are about to die. It's basically what we do in general, is we help people transition from life to death, just like birth doulas help babies come into the world. We help people leave the world. So yeah, I think I answered your question. I don't know. I go off on tangents.
No, that's fine. Hey, that makes for a good podcast, actually. My spouse is very much the same way. We have 2 dogs, 3 cats, a hamster, and 2 guinea pigs, because she also is constantly dealing with being suicidal, and that does help her have a reason to keep going. As far as the helping people transition, what does that look like as far as the amount of time you're spending with people, what you're doing for them, what you're talking about? Like, what does that look like?
It really depends on the patient, actually. And different doulas do different things. Like some doulas will get a degree in law so they can handle the legal aspects of death. I'm going back to school for thanatology, which is the scientific study of death, because I want to pursue my PhD in it so I can, I guess, get myself involved in more death studies. The pandemic kind of put a wrench in that. But I'll be going back eventually. But my current clients, what I offer right now is grief processing. We work with the dying and their next of kin, and it's a lot of it's just a lot of talking, honestly. It's a lot of talking, a lot of planning. Like, you plan like what the funeral is going to be. You tell them about their rights. You help them fill out an advanced care directive. Sometimes they like you to come and do rituals with them. There's a huge cultural aspect to it as well.
Right.
I'm currently reading the Quran because you got to read so many different religious texts, and you got to be open-minded when it comes to different religions. So there's that aspect of as well. So yeah, it really depends on the doula, and it depends on the patients. You got to listen to what the patients want. And yeah.
In your practice, do you find, more fulfillment or more value, or that your patients find you more valuable when you're dealing with the actual dying individual, or more the caregivers, the family around them, who seems to need the support of your services more, in your opinion, or does it totally vary?
It also varies. Like, it depends on the patients. I mean, I get fulfillment out of most of my patients. Some are a handful. Like, recently one family asked, because their family member passed away, and they were begging me to bring their family member back to life. And I had to tell them, I'm not a necromancer.
Yeah.
I'm a doula. And it's sad, but at the same time, these people, they're so desperate that they want their family member back. It's just, I think the dying does get more fulfillment than the family, because the family is usually distraught, and they just can't handle what's happening. And like, one of the worst things I deal with actually is family forcing their dying loved ones to continue life-saving measures, like keeping them plugged in. And it's just, that's another thing I do, is I try to reason with them, because I'm also a patient advocate, and I speak to doctors. I'm kind of like the mediator here. So I have to explain to families a lot, like, listen, they're suffering. It might be time to let them go. And so, yeah, it depends on the patient.
Yeah, I was witnessing something like that very much firsthand just this past year when my uncle's wife passed. She was already in a coma at that point, or at least on assisted machines, and not, as far as we could tell, cognizant of our presence. But they had already discussed, both my uncle and she, what the end of life should look like, and agreed between themselves that they didn't want to be living on machines. So if either one was in that place, but being in the room in the hospital with my uncle when he had to make that final decision was a very emotional time, but also it was interesting and heartening in a way, seeing somebody go through that, and actually seeing the culmination of having those discussions ahead of time, and seeing him make that very solid decision that they'd previously agreed upon when they ended up pulling the plug. It was actually a pretty powerful moment for me.
Glad you had that experience, actually. I know it sounds morbid when I say I'm glad you had that experience. A lot of people are taken aback by it, but death is a very, I don't know how to put it. I guess to me, like, grieving and death is a very cathartic experience. It's the most human thing a human can go through, in my opinion.
Also universal, so we all will have to deal with it at some point. And
yeah,
I guess the more you get to experience in real life, especially as you deal with people who are farther and farther away from you emotionally, kind of eases you into it a little bit too. If you're engaging with the deaths of, everyone usually starts with idols, famous people they don't know at all, but mean something in their life. That's like their first experience. Oftentimes, at least not necessarily the first, but often is the easiest experience with death, because it hurts and it tears you apart, but they're not this integral part of your life like a family member is. And then it ramps up as family goes through that process, and you experience that firsthand, someone you've known your whole life. And then, of course, everybody ends with processing it themselves with their own passing. So ideally, it builds. Of course, the real world doesn't always play by those rules.
Yeah.
And, you can get that in almost any order.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of processing death, I know this is deeply personal to you, so if you want, we can skip this entirely. But I wanted to ask if you would mind sharing the story of your coma and what perspective that gave you on the human condition and the end of life.
Well, I'm mostly an open book, so I'm completely happy to share and add insight into that. Because I experienced a coma, and then when I woke up, I had locked-in syndrome, so it was kind of a messed up experience.
Yeah.
So I'm also a type 1 diabetic, and somebody, I don't know who, I was out drinking with friends, and then I went to another friend's house, and I had a glass of vodka earlier, and somebody had slipped 200 milligrams of liquid methadone into my vodka.
Wow.
So a few hours later, I fell asleep at this friend's house, and they were a new friend. So they were scared because I was just not waking up. And basically my blood sugar, not only was I overdosed, but my blood sugar shot up to 1400. So I was just brain dead at that point. Like they wanted to test if I was actually like in a coma. So they put like this medical drill into my calf, and I didn't wake up. So
yeah. Wow.
It was an interesting experience because for the first few days, I almost had no brain activity, just a little bit, which is why they still, kept me alive, because I'm the type of person who's like, do not resuscitate. But I was still alive, and my parents were there, and so was my other family. And there would be moments where I would wake up a little bit and I could see my surroundings, but then I would go back to sleep. It was like general anesthesia, like a prolonged state of general anesthesia, kind of like death without the commitment. There was just like not existing.
Yeah.
And then my stepdad, went to the Lakota elders and told them what was happening. And I'm a very scientific and also spiritual person, so I have conflicting things in my head. But they went to the Lakota elders and they did a ritual and burned tobacco for me. And as soon as they burned that tobacco, I woke up. But I was in locked-in syndrome. I could not move anything at all, except for my eyes. But I was fully conscious, and I could hear and I could see, and it was terrible. The worst part was I had this giant, I was intubated at the time, so I had a big tube down my throat.
Yeah.
And they hadn't been giving me my medication while I was in a coma, because like I have the psychotic bipolar disorder. So not only was I seeing everyone walking around, there was also like shadow people and people I didn't even know walking around, because I was hallucinating. So it was just like weird. And then it's kind of fun. It was, if you've ever had sleep paralysis and then the night terrors that come with it, it was like that for 3 days straight.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the fourth day, I had like a weird Kill Bill moment, which is what I call it, where I was like trying to wiggle my toes. I was like, fuck yeah, I wiggled my toes. And I just kind of started inching up my body until I could move my fingers. And then I pulled the tube out of my throat, and all these alarms went off, and all the nurses came in. And they're like, no, don't do that. We're happy you're awake, but don't do that. And I was like, I've been awake for 3 fucking days. I was like trying to blink at you guys. But yeah, it was interesting. I don't like the circumstances of it, but I'm also kind of happy I had the experience, because it gave me more insight, I think. I've never truly been afraid of death or dying, but I was always kind of like, well, what if there is something after? That kind of scares me. And my family and friends joke that I'm immortal because I've had so many near-death experiences. like the coma. Like I've been thrown from a car, I've been stabbed. It's just, the list goes on and it's hilarious. But my biggest phobia in life because of this, and it's funny, it's completely irrational, is immortality. And I know it's irrational, but like every time I survive something, it's like, I should not have survived that. What is going on? And then I have to get blood transfusions once a month. So my friends tease me about that too. They're like, see, you're a vampire. Okay. Yeah. But it did give me a lot of insight into how patients who are in comas for a lot longer than I was only in a coma for a week. But there's people who go years, decades in a coma, and their family will not let them go. And that's all they want. That when I woke up and I realized I was in locked-in syndrome, I was terrified. I was afraid, okay, this is how it's going to be the rest of my life. And I don't want to live this way. And I think I might, because I do the patient advocate thing where I go to hospices and hospitals. It's changed a bit since COVID. But now that I'm vaccinated, I can go into the hospitals because I'm also immunocompromised because I have every disease on earth, like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. But
Mr. Burns germs.
Yeah, there's that one old episode where they're like, oh, you got every disease known to man. And they put a syringe in his arm and it goes through his arm because he's so skinny. I don't know. That was an old episode. But yeah, it's like that. So I had to get 3 vaccines, and then I went in. I got vaccinated early because I am a doula. So I can go into the hospital, and I do want to start adding coma patients to just the general clients that I deal with, because I think I can tell when they're actually conscious in there, because it's all in the eyes really. And I don't know what, I think like they don't want to put the work towards it because medical personnel are so overworked that it's just easier to be like, oh, they're brain dead. And I don't know. I think it did give me insight into a certain type of patient and life and dying. And I was like, okay, so this is what it's like to at least not exist, because I've been revived several times. But that doesn't qualify as legal death, Right. So yeah, I think I learned quite a bit, actually. It's hard to verbalize what I learned, though. Yeah. It's kind of an existential thing, actually. Yeah.
I don't think it's something you really can express verbally to someone who hasn't also experienced. It's one of those things that you have to go through it to even conceive of it. I mean, I have my own concerns, something like a locked-in syndrome or coma or any sort of dissociation between my body and mind is something that is one of my biggest worries in life, but I've never experienced it. So it's all this secondhand fog around it. But you have to really go through that sort of thing to understand it. So I can understand feeling you can leverage that personal experience when trying to view a person going through something similar or helping dealing with those around them who are confused and frightened of the situation.
Exactly. That's why the closest thing I can compare it to is a prolonged state of sleep paralysis. That's the best I can explain locked-in syndrome. And then a coma is just prolonged general anesthesia.
I did want to ask about ways to, so I guess a little context. There are a couple people on Facebook that have had people close to them die recently, and not anybody I'm close with or live near, but I've seen them talk about feeling a bit ostracized or feeling like people don't know how to deal with them, because for others who haven't experienced death, they tend to distance themselves from other friends who have to deal with that because they're more comfortable with denial of death. So I was wondering if you can provide any advice for how we should be engaging with friends who have experienced that loss in order to avoid adding the feeling of isolation on top of that.
Okay, so everybody is very different. Everyone grieves differently. So usually, and I do this with my patients too, I just kind of leave it open to them. Just tell them, I am here for you if you need me, no pressure. And you could also ask them if there's anything that you can personally do to help them. Because some people just want space. They want to mourn alone. That's how I am. I just like to be alone to process it. But some people, they want to be hugged or held, or they just want to vent. So it really depends on the individual, because mourning and grief is such a personal thing. And like you brought up in your question, people like to deny death in Western society, and it's a problem. And I think that adds to just the stigma of grief. I think there's a stigma around it, and people don't like being around depressed people as much as we want to, be mental health advocates.
Yeah.
We're really not good at being mental health advocates, because it is situational depression. It's not chemical. It's brought on by the fact that you're grieving and you lost somebody you care about. And so it really does depend on what that individual person wants. So I would honestly recommend just coming at them with, open arms and seeing what they need, or taking a step back if they want space.
Yeah, I think from what I've read too, that was one of the impetuses behind the rise of the death doula as an industry too, is the fact that there are these people that exist in a society of people around them who don't want to deal with death and interact with them about these concepts. So there's an entire profession of people who are there to, no matter what stage in life you're in, if you're dealing with concepts of death, whether you're dying, someone who's dying, or just afraid of dying, and you want someone to talk to about it, that's what the entire industry of death doula is there to, that need is being met, or is hoping to be met by that industry.
Exactly.
So I had a lot of difficulty preparing for this episode because I didn't want to think about the subject. I didn't want to think about how to articulate my fear, because that requires I contemplate the fear in the first place. The fear thing, let me provide a short backstory here as to why this episode is what it is. At the end of 2020, I had some comparatively minor health issues that have continued through this year. And experiencing daily pain and discomfort kind of was a shock to remind me of my limitations, something that was forced into my mind during every day in ways I hadn't experienced before. And because I have anxiety, that would kind of spiral into thinking, does this mean I'm dying? Do I have this disease or that disease? But it made mortality, I guess, clear or visceral in ways that had been abstracted and academic previously. And that fear of death that I developed led me to becoming depressed, which was a new kind of hell for me. I very quickly realized I had never actually been depressed before. Obviously, I've heard it described many times, and I studied neurology for a little while. I have a spouse who has chronic depression. But like you were saying, Trey, it's one of those things where you don't really understand it until you experience it. And that consistent gnawing at whatever constitutes my consciousness of this deep, piercing dread and inescapable loss of meaning and despair and helplessness. Like I really couldn't understand that until I experienced it, and it's a feeling that I never want to feel again. So at that point, I started going to a therapist because I had become so hopeless and so absorbed by an inevitable death that I had started contemplating unaliving myself so that I wouldn't have to live with that weight hanging over me. I think I described the experience as a sort of Lovecraftian forbidden knowledge that I had kind of sought for so long to understand the human condition, and in the process I'd seen something I could never unsee, and it caused a form of madness, I guess. Like I had crossed the threshold, and where I had previously been able to have simple pleasures, I had now lost that blissful ignorance. I guess another way to put that I liked that I had come across somewhere was I was able to imagine a limitless future, but with a new understanding of a limited life. That kind of put me on this journey of trying to actually address and come to terms with this existential crisis and of aging and of death. And so I want to sort of present, I broke this down into different fears, and so I wanted to present them as I experienced it and hear how you've thought of or experienced these, and then also talk about some ways that we can enact some form of death actualization to help ourselves cope and manage what it means to be a limited person.
Okay.
So one of the, I'll try and keep this brief. One of the earliest cognitive shifts for me was the recognition of the unstoppable march of time. Right. So there's that cliche, like when you're a kid, afternoons seem to stretch on forever. And then as I've aged, my life grows longer. I have really bad memory. So as my memories of the past sort of fade or disappear, that missing knowledge kind of causes the past to feel compressed. Like as if one day I was in high school and then the next I woke up this morning. And again, I know that's an old trope, but the one day you blink and you're
trope for a reason.
Yeah. But it was kind of meaningless until you experience that feeling. And so now I started to have this fear, like I'm going to wake up in my 70s one day and realize I'm close to the end, and it's like, that's it. So I started hyper focusing on every absurd measurements of time. I start thinking, everything I did yesterday is over. The conversation we had 15 minutes ago is gone now. Each moment I'm moving farther and farther into the future. I actually saw somebody phrase this as the long goodbye, that instead of experiencing a meaningful moment, we're thinking about what we're losing as the moment passes. And it's a really agonizing way to experience the world. And then along with that kind of comes the fear of the world moving on without me after I die. And any sort of legacy I might have fading away, I guess, like tears in the rain, to borrow a phrase. So I guess my question is, have you dealt with that fear of the endless march of time and the future coming too quickly, and how do you deal with that?
I've dealt with certain aspects of it. So I had my first existential crisis as a kid after my dad showed me Evangelion. I know that sounds hilarious.
Oh, wow.
My parents were anime fans.
Your parents sound amazing. 90s. Jesus Christ.
They are. There's a lot of viral photos of my family, like my quote unquote Uncle Jackal, who's holding a baby. He's all gothed out.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's amazing.
He's not my real uncle, but yeah. But anyway, yeah. So my dad showed me Evangelion, and it just made me think too much as a kid. And then I started comparing it to all the times I was sick in the hospital and witnessed other children die. Like the first child I witnessed die had cystic fibrosis, and I had to call the nurse because she flatlined. Wow. And yeah, and at that moment I was like, wow, that could be me. I can just be here one day and gone the next. And then I went to my first funeral, which was, side note, the first time I thought, okay, embalming is weird. Because
Yeah.
I just, the person looked like a wax figure.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, I was determined to not grow up because I didn't want to be old. I had a fear of being an old person.
Yeah.
For some reason, as a kid, I had a fear of being old because even though I am sick, I don't like to depend on anyone. Even as a kid, I was very independent. And then I realized, well, there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing so much on it, which is a lot easier said than done, to not focus on certain things, because especially when you have ADHD, because I know you do too,
Oh my
Danny.
God.
It just goes over in your head.
Oh my God.
Over
Yeah.
and over. You just sort of have to reach a level of acceptance. So for a while, I did have a fear of growing old, and not in the same way where like you wanted to, stop living and unalive yourself. I wanted to unalive myself just to stop the progression of time. I was like, I don't want to be old. Like when I'm old, I won't be able to go out and have fun. And because all I wanted when I was little was to go to clubs with my mom. Because I would see her get dressed up with her friends and she'd go out and I'd be stuck with the babysitter. And that's all I wanted to do. And I wanted to be stuck like at 20 years old or 21 doing all that.
Yeah.
Then I started getting older and older. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to be an adult soon.
Yep.
And there'll be this one great time, not this one great time, but this one great period of being adult and being an adult. And then I'll get older and then it won't be great anymore. So I just kind of had these weird concepts in my head as a child. And I think my mother also had a fear of getting old for a similar reason. She was really always obsessed with being pretty, and she doesn't want to be not pretty. Now that she's in her 40s, because my family breeds very young, because I'm in my 30s, she's like most people, when you reach your 40s, in my experience dealing with clients, you start to calm down about it a little bit, and you start to appreciate life in general. When you become really aware of your mortality and the fact that you don't have all the time in the world to be alive, you start putting more meaning in the things you do in life. And not even accomplishments, just relationships and just appreciating different little things. Like you have a child, and a lot of people, they really appreciate having a family, or some people appreciate their pets, and it makes life worth living to them because one day it will all be gone.
Yeah.
What you're describing seems to be the common view in at least the Western culture that I grew up in about the sort of myths of the various eras of life, where you're in your teens and that's the time of immortality and you're immune to everything and you can do anything. And then you get into your 20s and you're an adult, but you're not really thinking about being an adult. You're this very free. I have all this control. I'm away from my parents and I'm living my life to the fullest. And in the 20s, there's that great fear. Well, in the teens, you want to get to your 20s because you get all that extra power. In your 20s, you're afraid of your 30s because that's viewed as the end of life, sort of from the 20s perspective is, you stop being this adult in charge of their life and become, however you want to put it, a cog in the machine or just on the way out. You're no longer cool. You're no longer hip. You're just the old above 30 anti-rock and roll individual. And so that's the existential crisis of the 30s. And then, maybe as you said, Sanctus, the 40s give you a freedom from that. You lived through the treacherous 30s and you've come to terms with the fact that maybe it wasn't so bad, or however it fits in you, but that is sort of the progression as is kind of stereotypically laid out in our culture. And I think a lot of people's lived experience tends to bear that out, at least again, within our culture. Other cultures have wildly different views towards the different stages of life and what's important and what's not. But that's the one I grew up in. So that's the one I know most intimately.
Definitely. So just to add on to it, I just said, my older clients, I always talk to them like when they're ready to go, like they're on their last week of life. And the biggest regret that any of them have is worrying about the small shit and not appreciating the good shit in life. That's the number one regret that they have. They're like, I wish I didn't worry about being ugly or getting fat or whatever. They're like, I wish I just enjoyed life more and appreciated it more. But also on the flip side, the ones who did enjoy life, they're ready to go by that time. They're like, you know what? I enjoyed my life. I'm content. I'm happy. My family is cared for. Everything's going to be okay. And that's very common too. It's like a binary almost. There's like that group and then that group. And yeah, so they're usually, by the time they reach 80 years old, they're like, oh, I lived a good life and I'm pretty happy with what I accomplished. It's getting harder nowadays, especially with just the cost of living rising constantly. And people not being able to afford a fulfilling life. So I've seen a rise in the whole existential dread. And it usually starts around 30 years old. I only started as a kid because Evangelion. That's weird. But yeah, usually it starts around 30 because in our culture as well, there's this thing like, oh, you're not attractive anymore once you reach 30. Your life is over. You can't go clubbing. You can't have fun. It's like, why not? Like,
and you can't have children, apparently.
Yeah. Like, I always saw my 20s as sort of like an experimental phase, I guess, learning to be an adult. And then 30s is like you're actually an adult. And then 40s, you just kind of accept what life brings you. It is harder though when you do deal with mental illness and developmental disabilities and all kinds of stuff. Not everyone deals with these things, which is amazing. They're just raw dogging life, I guess. But yeah, it's getting more common that these existential things are happening because people are not happy that they couldn't afford to live a good life, and it's a problem. And it's really unfortunate how common it's gotten in the last 2 years alone, especially with COVID-19. Like so many people, myself included, we saw so many people die, and it's like, well, they couldn't really afford to have a good life and now they're gone. So there's a lot of that as well.
I'm going to complain about capitalism at the end of the episode as well.
Oh, go for it.
So for me, as far as coping goes with this the specific fear of time moving on and me being completely helpless to do anything about it, one of the first things we talked about in therapy was just working on being present, which, as you mentioned, is difficult with ADHD. So for what I started with was a daily meditation ritual. The goal of the meditation was to practice getting control over thoughts that would cause me to spiral, but also to be more present in the moment rather than worrying about the inevitability of the past or the future, because I would start to obsess over how old someone is. Like I would watch an old movie and then I'd look up the actor and see what they look like now and how old they were now and start to think about how quickly time moves and how I'll be in that position one day. And like my thoughts would just get out of control, right? So for me, meditation was developing the ability to notice that those thoughts were happening, because a lot of times I didn't notice, and I would have a series of bad thoughts and I didn't notice until I was in a really dark place. So then once I was able to notice it was happening, I could use other tools to shift my thoughts. So I'd do a couple different things. I'd either imagine I was sitting at a train station and the thought I was having was the train. And so like, because it's a train station, I know at some point that thought will leave and another one will come. And I just had to wait until it happened. Or you can do things. I know some people like imagine their thoughts as like a cloud drifting away or something like that. And then for meditation, just if no one has ever done that before who's listening, the way that I do it is I do a couple different ways, actually. I'll either count my breath in and then hold my breath and count for 4 seconds and then exhale and count my exhale so that I'm focusing on the counting and the physical feeling of my breath. Or I'll do, these are like common meditation things, but I'm sure some people like don't know about this. I'll do a body scan. So I focus on each part of my body and relaxing that part of my body. Or sometimes what I'll do if I'm having a real hard time with refocusing my thoughts to meditation, instead of counting, I'll say in my head, I'll say the word inhaling, 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 and then exhaling, exhaling, exhaling. And when I notice that I'm starting to think about something other than that, I'll say thinking, 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 because then I'm only thinking about saying the word thinking and I'm not thinking about whatever that other thought was. So it's that took me, I mean, I still struggle with it, but it took me a few months to be able to get to a place where I could use that in a practical sense in my daily life that would help me avoid spiraling through thoughts and then realizing that had happened after I was like, I don't know if I want to be alive anymore. And like, so getting out of that. And also obviously ritual itself, like you said, is important because ritual is an intermediate state. It's kind of considered an exit of time and place away from the usual social activities. So the nature of ritual is kind of the practice of transitions and growing comfortable with transitions, which is obviously has a corollary to death, right? So moving on from that, then the next thing I want to talk about sort of off of transitions is the afterlife, because for a lot of people, spiritual belief is a core aspect of dealing with death and existential crisis. So I want to ask the two of you, what are your beliefs on the afterlife and how does that impact your relationship with life and death?
I have mixed feelings because I feel like I have two brains sometimes. Like I have the spiritual side and the scientific side, but any good scientist knows that you can't disprove an afterlife, right? So I hold on to that as well. I follow a lot of Santa Muerte, a lot of aspects of it, because it's quite eclectic. Actually, I don't usually go for eclectic things, but it does allow for a lot of freedom. I don't know. It's a difficult thing for me to really process, actually, because I do help people with their own rituals, especially around dying. Like certain patients, you'll put up candles and incense and they'll do prayers in their own language. And it's a lot to take in. And then you think about your own spirituality. Plus, back when I was in a coma, it's like, okay, my brain was completely off. I didn't exist. And then all those times where my heart stopped, it was the same thing. So I'm like, well, maybe there's something and I just didn't transition far enough. So I don't know. It's a very confusing thing for me to think about because I don't really have an answer.
Yeah.
I wish I did, but I guess I don't. I really don't know.
I think it's confusing for most people, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I generally have kind of avoided the idea of an afterlife. Not really avoided, but it just never stuck with me that well or made a lot of sense to me. This idea that we have this finite existence that we're living in for some reason, and then we move on to some sort of infinite existence. The transition between those two states of finite existence and an infinite existence just never really parsed for me. I also have trouble with the mathematics of every person, every being, or whatever your belief is that has ever existed in the history, both known and unknown. all simultaneously existing in this other thing, this afterlife, and what that even means or looks like doesn't generally make a lot of sense to me. So I've always had just a lot of trouble embracing the concept of the sort of concrete eternal afterlife. Now, there are, of course, lots of other interpretations of afterlife, some of which I agree with more than others. To a degree, ideas of reincarnation make a little bit more sense, but also I struggle with, just because I don't know what, I don't understand what I guess the point is, since I have, at least my personal experience has no, that I can conceive of contact or connection to a previous life in a sort of cycle of karma or just birth and rebirth that's supposed to take you to some nebulous end goal of, whether it's a oneness or coming to some sort of cosmic understanding of reality and life. I've never really had that sort of experience that leads me down that line, though I would say that to me that makes more sense than this idea of everything that ever existing in the separate eternal realm. So a cycle of life does make a little bit more sense. I mean, a lot of my direct beliefs is, this finite sliver of time. I did not exist prior to my birth, and after I die, I will no longer exist again. I have this tiny little wedge of existence within the vast enormity of time that's existed, and that's what I get. And I try to, do what I can within that. And, as you were saying, living in the moment, not worrying too much about what happens after that, just like I didn't really worry about what was going on before it. So I just sort of live in that existence. And some of my, I guess, philosophical, ideological touchstones, I gravitate a little bit towards, I have my strongest gravitation towards a sort of Taoist belief, is what I've always sort of felt the most kinship with, at least from my not really formal, but very informal personal experience of it through reading and, experience it through anecdotes of other practitioners. There's also a little bit of Buddhism in there, which is interesting. I have some issues with it, but there's aspects of that click with me. And then going into some of the philosophical things, some of the Stoicism and some of the other stuff, that all these tend to sort of tie in with one another and tend to be grouped together a lot in at least the modern Western mindset. All of these things being somewhat foreign to that cultural basis as well, with Stoicism being the only real exception, though ancient Greek philosophy is kind of distant, even though it is from the same, I guess, branch of philosophical progress. But that's kind of how I deal with it. I just figure, when I die, it ends. If it doesn't, I'll take it as it comes, and I will deal with whatever comes next, just like I dealt with whatever came now when I was born.
Yeah, I actually want to bring up Taoism in my response to this. I guess for me, as far as what I think is most likely is that just sort of our consciousness slips away in, I guess you could sort of bring in the second law of thermodynamics, which is that all matter seeks entropy and will lose structure and separate over time. So too does the structure of the organized matter in our bodies lose coherence and separate. Now, I don't want to imply that consciousness is reducible to matter, but just to say I doubt that we retain a sense of identity after death, because I don't think there is a sort of essentialist supernatural element to being personally. I know for some, the idea of the void is a comforting thing. There are memes about it. Like, I've seen enough. I don't want to live, another eternity. This is enough. Thanks. Bye. For me, though, at least at the moment, that's kind of a terrifying idea. And this sort of that classic existential crisis around what is the void? What does it mean to not exist? And I kind of this year have been desperately wanting and longing to believe in an afterlife, to find some comfort, because I do desire to have a consciousness that spans a larger distance of time. Like, my parents don't have this fear of ontological death because they believe their consciousness will persist after death in heaven. And I have my own problems with that, because I think our consciousness is dependent on our embodiment. And so any form of spiritual embodiment after death necessarily means a shift in perception of the self and the world, rather than some clean, consistent continuation of being. But I would, at least at the moment, prefer something like that as rather than trying to comprehend non-existence, which is inherently impossible anyway. But doing that, trying to control the thing that I can't control, is part of what led me to feeling a loss of meaning in the world and feeling like nothing mattered at all. And so one of the things that really helped me is the Taoist story of the butterfly dream. And I'm going to pull this directly from a video by Philosophy in Motion on YouTube. I'll link that in the show notes. So if you're listening, I would recommend you check that out. But the story goes that there was a butterfly joyfully flying about, not aware of a Cho. And then one moment, Cho woke up. We don't know if Cho in a dream turned into a butterfly, or if a butterfly in a dream turned into a Cho. And the story is meant to emphasize the transformation of things. So there's an obvious parallel here between the common everyday transitions we experience and the less common transition from life to death. When we view death as just another transition, which are common and plentiful, it can help provide an easing of the mind, because death is just a part of the never-ending process of transformation. So just as you might transform into a butterfly tonight as you dream, you may transform into something else after death that may be content in its own way. The butterfly is not aware of Cho, and Cho does not remember the butterfly when he's fully awake. So if we free ourselves from the notion that we have some essential, authentic identity, and instead embrace transformation and the ever-shifting nature of being, we can turn worry into ease when contemplating the transformation of death. While I don't think there will be a continuation of my consciousness as it exists now, I think in some form, my component parts will take on new structures and new forms of being and new embodied enactments that will interact with and make up the world. So that does bring me comfort. And then another thing I found that, as far as life after death, that was helpful for me was a end of life plan, at least a non-formalized one, because I don't have a formalized one. But for me, doing simple things like talking to people close to me about how I'd like them to treat me when I'm dead. For example, telling people I'd like them to imagine that I'm still with them, so they can have a conversation with me and talk to me about their life, because I know I'd like to be around them. If I had that ability after death, I would spend time with them in their lives. If I was in that position, it would be wonderful for me if they were to talk back to me, right? Knowing, if I know that's going to happen in some way, that's a way of still existing in the world. Or, like what I'd like to do with my possessions and projects after I'm dead. It provided me some sense of control over the world after I'm gone, and kind of ensures I still live on in some intimate, meaningful way with people. So that was something that has brought me some degree of comfort.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of sort of the Buddhist idea of attachment and grasping too. This idea that, well, I mean, the core principle of Buddhism, that the whole life is suffering thing, is all about it's a self-inflicted suffering, because we're so resistant to this idea of change and transition that we grasp onto what we know now and hold on to it, and the constant strain between that holding on to this static thing for dear life, trying to keep it from changing, is what leads us to a self-inflicted suffering. And I find that a pretty interesting perspective of things. I had an issue with Buddhism early on with the idea that life is suffering, but once I understood it in those terms, it does make a little bit more sense. I don't necessarily gravitate towards still the sort of pithy adage that life is suffering. I think that's a little bit unsatisfying as an adage.
Yeah.
It does need the additional context that's frequently lost. But with the context, it does help. And I think it's an important aspect of the way I view life. Another thing that was interesting to me, and it's a bit of a fabricated religion, but in Octavia Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower, the entire series of that, which is the Earthseed series, there's an invented religion called Earthseed, which is interesting in that the main tenet behind it, and there it is a single mantra, which is the only lasting truth is change. God is change.
Interesting.
And I found that very interesting when I read that a few years ago, when I encountered that series, which, enhanced my perception of life and meaning and transition and, death being the ultimate one.
Right. I also wanted to ask about, talking about meaning and how you find meaning, because, when I had a more essentialist view of the world, it felt like there was ground beneath my feet. And when you kind of have that realization of the finite nature of reality, it can be disorienting, and part of that existential crisis of losing a foundation and thinking if you decide there is no ultimate answer. So I'm wondering how you find purpose and meaning in life after the realization of an inevitable end.
Basically, in the work I do, I'm naturally kind of a nihilistic person, but I am an optimistic nihilist, I think. By helping others come to terms with their own mortality, it gives me purpose. Same with taking care of others. I'm too sickly to have my own children. So I take in animals like Roz. Roz was an unwanted kitten because his mother died in childbirth. He was very small and malnourished. But I found purpose in rehabilitating him, just like I find purpose in rehabilitating rats and just helping people in general. I'm also an activist. I don't brag about my activism very much, but like every year I do a toy drive for children around Christmas, and I just do a lot of things like that, and mutual aid. And I find purpose basically in doing things that I personally think are genuinely good and helpful.
Yeah.
My senses as far as meaning and purpose in life are very similar. What I do in life, my legacy, my purpose, whatever it is reflected in those things that I touch, those things that I create, those things that I interact with, be they artifacts in the world or the people around me, those who I interact with, and the value those actions have on their lives, from trivial to grandiose. It doesn't have to be, the grandiose of going out and caring for the sick and the dying, or going and feeding the hungry, or going to feed the poor. Those are great, and those are, grand things that you can do, and by all means do them. But even the simple thing like holding the door for somebody, it causes an effect on the world. And that's what my legacy is. My legacy, I choose to use this time where I exist to act in the world in a way that at least I think makes the world a better place. So that's where my meaning is. It's not, I don't have any meaning in and of myself. My meaning only exists in relationship to the world around me and the others that exist within it. And some of the things that really make me feel okay about life and death, I guess. A lot of them are summed up. One of my favorite writers is Terry Pratchett, who has some wonderful quotes and thoughts about death and dying. And one of my favorites is, about, how your existence lasts on. It's basically no one is actually dead until the ripples they cause in the world die away. And then along the same lines, do you not know that a man is not dead while his name is still spoken?
Oh yeah, second death.
Mm-hmm. So
Second
those concepts just bundle into, my how I keep meaning in my life, and where I focus on to give my life meaning is, making those ripples and giving people reason to speak my name.
Right.
And that's even things like just this podcast. This podcast is an artifact that you've created and I've been a part of for a long time. And this will last beyond both of our lives.
Yeah.
As an artifact. And, all the people who have listened to this podcast and all the people who they've touched as well, those ripples go out there, and that prolongs our existence and gives, at least to me, life meaning.
Yeah, I think one of the things I had to deal with was moving away from the idea that meaning and purpose had to be something universal and timeless rather than ephemeral like everything is. So I tried starting by focusing on what I could control. That was the first thing I started with earlier this year. So easy stuff like diet, exercise, my behavior, the way I interact with people, that kind of thing. And then I found really drilling down to a micro scale was helpful as well. There's a saying in paganism that I've come across that is macrocosm to microcosm, microcosm to macrocosm. And I think finding a way to understand the macrocosm through the microcosm by engaging with it has helped me. So like experiencing nature was always calming for me, but I can try and really focus on admiring a leaf and thinking about all the ways it supports life and in return is supported, or looking at a patch of soil and pondering the intricacies of just this small little bit of ground, which helps me focus on the moment. And I think this can be useful in finding meaning because I know I intuitively, and I think this is kind of a cultural thing, but intuitively felt that meaning had to be something grand and expansive and important. But it doesn't. It can literally just be what I care about right now. And this is something I actually took from Abraham Piper, who is the son of John Piper, who's this conservative evangelical pastor that you'll know if you grew up in the kind of churches I grew up in. But his son is an atheist and talks about philosophy and stuff. But he talked about how your life's purpose can literally just be what you're doing right now. So right now, my life's purpose is having a conversation with you. Or, whatever. It could be making your next meal or cleaning the bathroom. It doesn't have to be something that's relevant into the future, because the future is the next right now. And so that's a way to help avoid that emotional pain of loss of meaning by accepting that there is no universal meaning. It's the important thing is my purpose is what I'm doing right now, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you have to create your own meaning. Like a lot of people think it's disgusting that I rescue and rehabilitate rats.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, they just like, it's disgusting. They're rats. And it's like,
I guess there's a stigma.
Yeah, there's all kinds of stigma.
They're my rats, though. And they're my little rats.
Yeah.
And I don't care if me rescuing these little rats doesn't really help anyone else. It helps them and it helps me. And yeah, we've got to create our own meaning, because we can't really find meaning within others. We can help others, but they can't give us that meaning. So we got to, really goes down to like appreciating the small things in life again.
Yeah.
Like just appreciating the little things that bring us happiness or joy or whatever.
Yeah, there's also a danger that a lot of people are prone to in comparison. In, oh, my meaning isn't good enough because I'm not great hero X. And unfortunately, our culture is rife with, whether they're literary or film based or, famous people, great politicians, great whatever. We have all these great individuals that we, like we do on Facebook with, just our contacts, we constantly compare ourselves to these myths in our history. And that is, frankly, it's just toxic. It's dangerous to do. It's nice to have those as an aspiration, but as a comparative of I'm not good enough, just leads you to not wanting to do anything because you feel that there's nothing you can do that will meet up to these impossible standards of these mythologized figures. And so we oftentimes will fall into that trap, and being able to focus on, like you were saying, Danny, what you can do, what you can control, and the little things, and just being able to find meaning in, yeah, I can't create world peace, but I can pick up this can and throw it away. Mm-hmm. Or, I can help this person when they just broke up with someone, or, I can hold the door open for this stranger, whatever it is, great or small, you find meaning in that in the moment. And those build up. If you can do something great, fabulous. And, keep an eye on that, but don't get disheartened thinking you just can't. And if you can't, then it's not worth it.
Mm-hmm. The end of life isn't the only fear I have, and actually, Sanctus, you brought this up earlier, and I think this is obviously a common ancillary fear, which is aging, right? I was young. I know how young people think about old people. There's this sort of condescending bemusement, similar to how some people view children. It's like a sort of infantilization.
Okay, boomer.
Oh, yeah, it's very out of sight, out of mind. Put the old people in the old folks' home. They're in the way. Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate.
Even in the goth scene, Trey, you mentioned, I don't remember what episode, but you've mentioned before how when we talk about our icons of goth from the 80s, we romanticize their young bodies and don't really celebrate them for who they are today.
I hit on that the most in the Aging and Goth episode, I believe.
That's what, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There might have been another one where I talked about vampirism and the concept of vampirism being a lionization of the eternality of youth. And this idea that we need to keep ourselves beautiful to hold on to that youth. It was a counterpoint to an argument that goths are better at dealing with death and mortality.
Aging, yeah.
I'm like, the behavior doesn't seem to match that to me, because we do seem to lionize this pristineness with, the white makeup and vampirism and stuff like that, we are hiding the signs of decay.
Yeah.
At least the human signs of decay. We're fascinated by material decay, whether they're decaying cemeteries or buildings or lace dripping off of a body, but not so much crow's feet and wrinkles and cellulite and varicose veins. Those don't seem to get the same, that sort of decay doesn't seem to get the same lionization as some of the others do.
Yeah. And speaking of that decay, after I came out as non-binary and I started presenting more femme, that sort of academic understanding of patriarchal beauty norms became more of a lived reality, and I could see a roadmap to my obsolescence, and I felt the pressure of the expiration date on my beauty as a femme presenting person, which was an interesting thing to have to start to deal with. And you like you said, you put them in a home. You avoid the young, avoid the old, because they're afraid of being reminded that they won't be young forever. So how do we deal with that fear of aging, or the fear of irrelevance in old age, or that kind of thing?
So I actually think that it has a lot of problems, but I think the body positive movement actually has been helping with this a bit when it comes to bodies in general. I'm more into body neutrality, and I cannot speak for, fat people because I'm not a fat person. So I won't speak on their behalf, but bodies in general, they age. We get older, we get wrinkles, and I think that it's actually helped people accept that a little bit, but it's not quite mainstream yet.
Yeah.
And we as a culture need to work towards mainstream, because like there's many other cultures that actually celebrate aging. And I think we need to redefine beauty a little bit. There's nothing inherently ugly about wrinkles. I think wrinkles are beautiful personally. They signify someone's lived a long life, and they have wisdom and they have experience. But I think the stigma really does lie in fear. We do put old people away because we don't want to be reminded that that will be us one day. And also right now, we are reaching a point where we're going to have a lot of aging people, especially in the prison population. There's going to be a lot of geriatric prisoners. Going to be my next step is working with them, but I digress. We really need to redefine our values here a bit. It's a lot of work, but I think the body positive movement actually has helped kind of get the foot in the door there a little bit. But we do need to work on it. I wish people, it always starts around age 32. It's like your health starts to get a little worse when you reach your 30s, and you're like, it's just going to get worse from here. And it doesn't have to get worse, at least aesthetically, at least physically. We can learn to appreciate the process of aging, and I think we should.
Yeah, I agree.
There's also an arbitrariness to judgment of better and worse to some degree. What is getting worse? Is it really getting worse? I mean, yes, you've got some things that you could maybe consider as absolute, as far as losing ability to function in certain ways, whether it's mobility or cognition or whatever. But there are also aspects that you've gained. So what are you focusing on as far as what is good, what is bad, what is better, what is worse? And, reframing those sorts of things, I think, can help as well as you go into those twilight years when you feel things that you used to be able to do, you can no longer do. And that causes concern and struggle and anxiety.
I realized a lot of my fear came from me projecting myself into the body of older people that I would see and didn't like out in the world. Like older people in boring mute clothing yelling about how kids are evil or talking about golf all day. And I didn't realize that I was doing that, but I kind of realized like those were never people that I would have been like when they were young either, which means that I don't have to be someone like that as I age. So I tried focusing on those who are older than me that I admire, that live in ways that I aspire to live, who I find deeply relevant and wise, and kind of realizing I don't have to be this bland husk of a person devoid of a personality, with no passion. And that was a big help. I don't have to be the older person who doesn't understand technology and can't relate to anything beyond their favorite decade, or who hates kids because they're afraid of them, that kind of thing. And it kind of brings me back to this confrontation with the movement of time that is so jarring, partly because of the way I think we present time culturally. So, for example, in goth circles, there's this sort of abstracted group of posers, which creates this idea that posers are always there and they're always the same people with the same goals working against the scene. The same thing happening in the media. There's always comedians making jokes about what it's like to be middle-aged, and always TV shows exploring what it means to be middle-aged. And it gives the illusion of something fixed and static until you experience that thing. Maybe this is just me, but I always kind of felt like there's this group of actors who are eternally 50, And then you get to 50 and you realize, oh shit, like those people are now in their 70s, right? So you have this paradigm shift in perception of time. And this is kind of similar to Ernest Becker's theory that one of the main functions of culture is to help us successfully avoid awareness of our mortality. I do think that's true for American culture. I think that's not the case. You already said it's not the case for all cultures across all time. And it's kind of a Eurocentric analysis of that. But in my relation to experience with culture, recognizing that we devise all sorts of strategies to escape the awareness of the movement of time and vulnerability and mortality is important to recognize that. But I also think it's a good way to start treating others with more humanity and hopefully avoid that extreme existential shock at some point in the future, because we've sort of relegated that to a thing that will happen at some point. And then when it happens, it's like, it feels like it's the end of the world.
I agree. Also, there's this issue with Gen Z I've noticed a lot. And a lot of them, because I study death and I track trends when it comes to death. And a common trend with Gen Z, especially if they deal with mental illness, is they will say, I didn't expect to live to 30. I thought I would die or kill myself or this or that. So they can't really put themselves in the shoes of actually aging and getting older. And it's like, oh, well, I survived. Now what? Now I'm scared. Now I don't know what to do. And that's becoming so common. It's kind of weird, honestly. It's like, well, you can't really know if you're going to die or not. I mean, we could all die tomorrow. We don't know, but just, I don't know. It's an interesting trend, to say the least.
I haven't really seen that as a trend, but I mean, as that much different than the old, don't trust anyone over 30 mythos, or the ideas that led to things like the 27 Club. That there's been a persistent idea amongst especially 20 somethings, like I was saying about the 30s being this great existential end. And I think it's always, well, I can't say always, but I think it has been a not uncommon sense that, maybe it would be best to die. Heck, we even had Logan's Run, where you're killed at 30. Just that's the way the society runs. So, I mean, that idea that this big 30, I don't know what the focus on that is. That seems a strangely arbitrary number to focus on, but maybe because that's the death of the carefree life, perhaps, that, you have your 20s to be an adult with somewhat limited responsibilities traditionally, but then 30, you're in that grind.
Yeah. You're not wrong, but when I mean trends, like there's always been that existential trend of like, oh, everything ends at 30. But this specific trend I'm talking about is these kids thought they would kill themselves by 30. That's what they're saying. They're like, I thought I was going to kill myself. So this hasn't been as prevalent in the past, which is, I think, another reason why, especially right now, also with like, there's people using filters when they take selfies. It's like there's an obsession with being young, especially if you're feminine.
Yeah.
Like you lose all value after 30. And that's not a new thing. No. It's just the whole, I was going to kill myself before 30 because I'm that mentally ill. It's just there's so many layers to this, and it's a huge cultural problem that I think it's going to take a while to dismantle it and fix it. And it definitely does go into capitalism as well. I actually had to laugh a bit at Trey's comment earlier when he what is your pronouns, Trey?
I don't actually care, but he is fine. I mean, technically I like all of the pronouns to be inflicted on me as frequently as possible because I like the confusion.
Okay, so what did you say? You said like good politicians or something. I was like, oh, that's an oxymoron. But
I think I was talking about people who do grand things on the world stage.
Yeah,
whether they be good or bad, but it depends on what side. But I see what you're where that could
Yeah,
be
it was just
funny.
hearing the two words together, because I'm a staunch anarchist. Like, I'm an anarcho-tribalist, so I believe in tribalism, and just anarchy is a means to an end, but that's not the topic of this video. That could be something else another time. But yeah, I think our political climate, especially lately, does kind of affect everything happening, especially in regards to death, because unfortunately politics do really impact the death industry on a pretty significant level. And it's an issue. It's definitely an issue, one that I don't know how to solve entirely, but I'm studying, I guess.
I mean, especially around some of the good death and natural death movements, where you've got local regulations around, things that again, as we already said, don't make sense with modern technology and modern abilities to manage, death and dying. Things like mandating, embalming because it's sanitary, mandating proper cemetery construction and sealed vaults and stuff like that because it's quote unquote sanitary, because we have this long history from medieval times about the cemetery at the top of your water source infecting the town because they didn't know how to deal with it. But we do know things about microbiology and decay and how diseases are transmitted through things like that. That legislation is slow to catch up with what we can actually do, and is based on these sort of traditions, even when they become outmoded.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has any helpful advice for this, because I don't really, but and this was also brought up earlier, but the fear around, since we're talking about aging, the fear around the pain and decline of age, and worrying about how many possible different ways I could suffer in old age. Like, as I mentioned earlier, as I started experiencing pain on an almost daily basis this year, that made real the idea of that experience of suffering and pain that I hadn't had before. Like, some people have dealt with that their entire life, have a different perspective, but it wasn't something I had experienced before. And so imagining the mental and physical decline of age became more tangible. Worrying about dementia or whatever, it makes me wonder how I'm going to suffer. Am I going to wish that I was dead, or I could die? Will I be ready to go, or will I be afraid to go? Right? Like, if I can't speak, like, how will I feel if I can't express myself? Am I going to be confused all the time or angry all the time? Am I just going to be kind of in my own happy little world? Like, I mean, obviously there's no way to know, but there's that anxiety around that kind of thing. And I don't know if maybe just spending time with people in that state is a way to deal with that, or what. I don't know if if you have any insight on that.
So I have a couple bits of advice here. First, the legal. I would highly recommend filling out an advance care directive if you haven't. They're free to do. You just ask your doctor or a hospital for one. And that in an advance care directive, you basically fill out what you want to do in case of some sort of medical thing happening. Like, if you can't basically advocate for yourself, and you can also appoint someone else to advocate for you in those, like your wife or a close friend, or even your son when he's old enough to, which usually is the best, is your children, as long as you have a good relationship with your children. Not everyone does. Also, a living will is another good idea, but that's more legal. You would have to get a lawyer to help you with that. A lot of doulas are also law students or lawyers. I'm not one, because I'm taking the more scientific approach rather than the legal approach, but they can also help you with that. Also, Yeah, because in your advanced care directive, you can make an end of life plan and an emergency plan and all that. Also, spending time with people who are in hospice actually does help, just listening to their stories, getting their perspective. I mean, some of them you want to avoid, like some of them are like really racist, bad people. And they just, there's a reason they're in a home, but most of them aren't. Most of them are in a home because their family is just too busy to deal with them. They became a nuisance, and it's really sad. They hire us doulas to basically step in for them. And I've found, because I did have a fear of aging, I wasn't afraid of dying, I was afraid of aging. Hanging around older people and even helping my great grandmother when she was getting ready to pass away. I hate that term. When she was getting ready to die, just being around her and just helping her out and listening to her really helped ease my fears. But it's also good to remember that suffering will happen. It's inevitable, but immense suffering isn't inevitable. We're all going to feel pain. We don't even have to be old to feel pain, but that doesn't mean the pain is going to be excruciating or intolerable. It's a possibility, but it's not really set in stone. Also, like in my family, we don't believe in nursing homes. We keep our elderly in our homes, and family takes turns taking care of them. And I think a lot of people should transition to that. I think patients do better when they're around familiar environments with families. And I think that's another good thing to consider when you're creating an end of life plan. And I think people should start creating end of life plans as early as possible. So there's a few things. And then therapy, of course, and meditation helps some people. It doesn't really help me because I just end up fighting with my other brain. But if it does help you, then it's a great way to come to terms with the inevitable. And also, we go through the four stages. I think it's 4 stages. I don't know. We go through the different stages, and eventually you reach acceptance. And when you reach acceptance, which I have, it's very freeing. It's like a weight is taken off your shoulders. And it takes a while to get there for most people who didn't have early exposure like I did. And it's a bit of work. But acceptance is something most people reach by the time they are older, unless they get dementia, and that's a whole other can of worms. But like I said, if you need to creative end of life care for dementia too, because dementia itself isn't fatal, but the side effects and everything do make it fatal. You will die from it because of everything that comes with it. So you need to make, like, if that runs in your family, if it's hereditary, then you want to consider that as well. Consider all the possible medical things that might come up if you have some hereditary or genetic issues in your family.
Right.
And I think for you, Danny, what you mentioned earlier around, just your perception of the elderly and what they are and can and can't be, extends to the same thing, extends to concepts of what being old and infirm is. Just having more examples, having more people that you're around that give you a more complicated view of what life in an infirm state in, whether they're in a home or in a hospice or being cared for by their family, just more variety than just that one idea of the invalid who's bedridden and has to have a catheter and is being, tended to by some cartoonishly brutish nursing person at a nursing home. That sort of mythology around that is harmful, and it exists, and that's a problem in and of itself, but it is not the only thing. And having more examples to see in life, I mean, in general, just having more examples of anything, having this is the whole diversity argument in general. But the more varied ways of existing in the world that you see, the more that gives you sort of the freedom of choice, because you don't feel like you're stuck in one rut going to this one goal because that's all you've ever seen. You see all this wide, massive variety of lives and cultures that interact with all of these things in different ways, and that gives you the freedom to some degree to choose what seems to fit best with you at that moment, and that can change as well. And then also an interesting thing around the stages of grief that you mentioned, Sanctus. The idea, one of the flaws I've seen with that, or one of the things that people tend to get caught up, is the fact that they are usually put in a specific order, and people get really concerned if they feel they've skipped a stage or are in the wrong stage. I mean, it always pretty much will always end with acceptance, though acceptance can oftentimes gain some cracks. You have acceptance, but then you backslide sometimes too. But this idea that they have a set order is really problematic for some people, and has been a cause for stress with a lot of people, that they don't feel like they're progressing correctly. And that idea that there's a correct way to progress through those stages, even the idea that the stages are inherently correct and universal, is its own problem. But beyond that, just the fact that they have this sort of correct means is a huge cause of stress for people.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my final frustration in coming to terms with mortality is discovering my lack of agency in relation to capitalism. So once I realized
and turn to the
left. Once I clearly realized the finitude of my time on Earth, it really put into perspective a lot of things. Like, I'd like to travel, I'd like to have new experiences, spend time with people that I care about, do fun stuff, right? But that desire is trumped by the reality of capitalism, which demands my labor and my time and provides barely enough for me to exist, let alone travel to new places. And that conflict which feels like a forceful removal of authorship over my life, is mind-numbingly oppressive. I try not to think about the experiences I'm missing out on by working 10 to 12 hours a day with, barely enough money to pay for medical bills and food. And it's like this, it's a crushing weight. And, I mitigate that to some degree by using this podcast, for example, to talk about those issues and provide methods of action to make change. Which is something we've done explicitly on previous episodes. But the progress of, changing that structure is something that's I don't know if it will change in my lifetime. But, it's that idea that I feel like I could spend an eternity with my son, just enjoying life, just that one thing, among a myriad of things and hobbies that I would like to do. And that a lot of my time, though, is taken against my will. I think we are agents in the world, but we are co-creators. We're constituted by other agents and by the world around us, and also necessarily constrained by the societies that we partake in, willingly or unwillingly. So, we generate capital for our bosses during our most able years of life, with the majority of our time. And so that leads to, I think, a culture that fantasizes about other worlds in social media, in video games or whatever, because we can pretend that we are building our own reality in those places and ignore the degree of the lack of choice that we have in our own lives, because of this, that virtue of hard work through employment that's in our society. So that was really difficult for me. The recognition of ultimate mortality and a ticking clock which I hope, I would like to think, as people realize that, it will kind of put light to the lie of capitalism, so that we can start to change that and be able to create our own means of fulfillment rather than producing it for other people. But it's a very difficult thing to swallow, I guess.
I think a lot of us are kind of dealing with that. Not even just the goth scene, because there's so many people just leaving their jobs right now.
Yeah.
Like, people are fed the fuck up. I don't know if you've seen my posts. You probably, because the algorithm sucks on Facebook. But my biggest struggle that I deal with, and this is actually capitalism in relation to death and all that stuff, is something I'm very bitter about, because I am a type 1 diabetic, and every month it is a hustle to afford my insulin.
Yeah.
And it's $600 a vial. And people are like, oh, just take a plane to Mexico or fly over to Canada. Like, if I had the money to take a plane to Mexico or fly out to Canada, then I just buy my insulin. And it's like, my insurance will cover 1 vial a month when I need 5. And it's like, so I'm just sitting here working my ass off constantly. And it's like, I love the work I do. I love it. But sometimes I just want to not work.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to have that choice, whether you like it or not.
Yeah,
you want to be able to, on a day-to-day basis, choose what you want to focus on and value that day rather than having it chosen for you.
Exactly. Yeah. And the problem is, some people can take a day off, and maybe that means like no groceries for the day. Or if I take a day off, that means I die, because I will die within a week without insulin. So it's like, I don't have a choice. And it's just, I want to travel as well. And I want to just maybe retire one day. I don't think that's going to happen at this rate. I don't know, but capitalism and the death industry, which is another reason I decided to go against being a mortician, is extremely predatory. It's extremely predatory, and which is why I charge based on income. Like, if someone's low income, I will give them a lower rate for what I do. But the death industry, that's another thing that doulas do. We kind of help wade through all of the bullshit. Yeah. Like, oh, you need this and this and this and this. And like, you don't need all this and this and this and this. There's cheaper ways to do funerals and end of life services. But it's like, I'm over capitalism. And I think most people are, unless they're capitalists.
There's so many different ideas of what capitalism is and what its important to society is. And the fact that we're having this debate about a word that we can't even oftentimes agree on what it means makes the debate next to useless. And that's one of the major problems is, people will lionize a form of capitalism because they look at the benefits of it. And then the people who demonize it because they only look at the downsides of it. And it's just, there's no concrete, this is the totality of capitalism and its pros and cons. We sort of refuse to look at either the pros if you're against it or the cons if you're for it. And it basically takes this entire conversation off the rails in most forums.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's why I do think that conversation is interesting, but I think if we can try and focus on talking about protests and political action and building cooperative communities with members of the working class rather than focusing on things that divide us and fighting over that, so that we can start forming unions and co-ops and changing the way that businesses are run, or starting our own businesses, developing relationships with our neighbors, starting community projects, that kind of stuff. That's one way that we can, without having to start with an argument about what we think capitalism is. That's one way we can find common ground and move towards more ways of living that are owned by the working class, kind of thing.
Or even just owned by everybody.
Yeah, well,
rather than having that distinction.
After we eat the billionaires.
That nuance is a thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
you're fine. We were interrupting you, so don't apologize to us.
I'm sorry. No, I just wish people would realize that nuance is still a thing. Like there's no nuance, and people just, they're black and white. And then there's the issue of a lot of people just get their information from memes. I've noticed.
Oh yeah.
Like people will say like, this is late stage capitalism. And I'll look at it. I'm like, no, it's not. What the fuck are you? What? Like, did you even like look up the definition of that term or word you're using? And it's frustrating.
It is.
And it's like, yeah.
I think though also that's in a way you could also blame that on the pernicious nature of capitalism, because capitalism demands our labor and our time, and to be able to have a clear view of the history and theory and practical effects of economics and the way that works requires labor and time, but that's kind of stolen from us. So what we can, we can kind of scroll through whatever social media and pick some things up here and there that sound correct, but it is, it's hard to put in the emotional labor of reading a whole bunch of articles about that kind of thing. So, but there's also some degree of like, you should also still try and do some research if you can, but yeah.
Right. We're too beholden on our curated lives and letting other people determine where our information is coming from and what gets talked about. And that's why we're being so prone to siloing and finding our own echo chambers, because we might have some fuzzy ideas about what we like and what we don't like and what a thing is. And then we gravitate towards, or the algorithms gravitate us towards, whether we want to or not, an echo chamber that basically feeds back on that same belief, and then it reinforces it and causes a belief that everybody feels this way, and the people who don't feel this way are a minority, so we have the power, and somehow we're being silenced by the minority. Whatever side we're on, we're all being silenced by some invisible minority that has all this power, because we just don't engage with the parts of the world that disagree with us. And with that sort of very blindered view of the world, it's hard to see that there is such a diversity of ideas and opinions, and that it needs to be talked about with more nuance, and with more than just this all or nothing black and white concept in everything. And it's just been getting worse and worse in my lifetime, that this concept of black and white in all things. And then the misunderstanding about every single ism out there. If it's got an ism, it's got as many definitions as there are people who use the word. And that prevents us from having any sort of productive conversation about any of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, do we have another hour to talk about this? Because we can get into it. No. So that's. I think that's good. I think we can leave it there. I think we covered everything I wanted to, and I really, really appreciate your insight, Sanctus. And this is cathartic and scary, but I think it's important to talk about, and we all have to work through this process, right? So it's better and easier doing it together, I think.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was my pleasure, 100%. Well, have a lovely night. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Album review.
All right, so now it is time for the album review. Okay, so this month we are talking about the album Camera Obscura by the band. Trey, do you want to try and pronounce that for me?
I mean, I would go with Morte Psíquica.
All right, sounds good to me. This is from their Bandcamp page. They are a band based in Montreal, Canada. They are a post-punk darkwave project originally founded in Évora, Portugal. Their music is sculpted from sharp interlaced guitars, robust vocals, strictly spoken in Portuguese, idiosyncratic drum beats, and anxious drum lines.
Bass lines.
Anxious bass lines. So let's play a track from the album. My favorite track was probably track 4, but I don't know if that's a good representation of maybe the first track.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost any of the tracks would be fine. There wasn't, at least to me, any like major standouts or major lows in the album. I think they were all very good in their own way, different, but not so wildly so that you could pick one that's would completely give the wrong impression of the band.
Yeah. I think I also like to not play my favorite track so that people will then go listen to what my favorite track was to get them over to the Bandcamp page. So
it'll at least make them listen to 2 tracks.
Yeah. So let's play the first track, which is I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. Let's play the first track.
I think Relatividade Restrita.
What? You wanna be let out? I'll be done in a minute, honey. I know. Look, I'll let you out in a minute, okay? Everything you need is in here, unless you have to pee, in which case it's not in here. Okay? Just hold it if that's the problem. So, I liked this album, and I think it's interesting because we talk about the goth music revival a lot, and I've said before there aren't many bands currently that are straight up gothic rock music. There are bands like that, but there aren't a proliferation of them like there are other genres. And I think that's probably because in the 90s, a lot of people got sick of that sound because we had dozens of Sisters of Mercy sound-alike bands or rip-off bands, if you don't want to be charitable. And, most people are aware of the more successful ones like Merciful Nuns and Merry Thoughts, Rosetta Stone, The Mission, The Wake even. But I'm not exaggerating when I say there were dozens and dozens of bands who aped that sound. And most of them are largely unknown because they only put out an EP or they were just really awful and derivative. Like I know Scary Lady Sarah has a folder on her hard drive full of literally just bands that sound like the Sisters of Mercy. It's really funny. She's done a few streams where she's just played some of those tracks, and I had never heard of like half of them. That said, though, I don't necessarily want to just compare this album to those other bands. That's just to kind of say why I don't think there are many people doing that sound. A lot of modern bands that take inspiration from the sisters, like She Passed Away or Golden Apes or Terminal Gods, they all do something a bit different than being a down the line clone of the sisters. And when it comes to this band, it feels kind of more like a lounge version of Sisters of Mercy to me. It's more laid back. It's more slow tempo. There is a good groove through each song that I think you can totally sway to and kind of enjoy if you were on the dance floor. But it's not like a super dancey, beat-driven kind of music. And it's also not a dirge either. It really kind of feels like it gave me the feeling of a sad gray day spent wandering outside. That's what this brought to mind for me.
Okay.
I don't know what they are singing about because it's in Portuguese, but I have to imagine it has to do with many of the themes we've discussed on this episode. That's just what it feels like sonically. I am a sucker for post-punk guitar and melodic bass lines. So even if it is people are like sick of hearing that kind of thing, it's still going to get me every time. May not listen to it over and over like I would some other stuff, but I will at least enjoy it on an initial listen. There are some tracks with acoustic guitar, which is my favorite was track 4, because I felt like it had more of a romantic sound to me. It actually did remind me a lot of the Golden Apes, which is one of my favorite bands. And like, I think that's fine. There's a place for this kind of comfort food band. And sometimes you just really need that kind of emotion and that kind of sound. And it's nice that there are new bands that you can reach to get that without having to listen to stuff from the 80s you've heard a million times. So overall, I yes, I did keep expecting the singer to belt out Marianne at some point on the album, but it is a solid, enjoyable record, and I'd give it a 3.5 out of 5. Definitely something I enjoyed listening to.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that for the most part. It was a solid gothic rock album. Pretty straightforward, but not, in my mind, it wasn't really that derivative either. There was certainly a lot of things that were reminiscent of, bands you'd mentioned and big classic bands from the past. Especially early on, I was getting a strong Mission or Rosetta Stone feel from them. More so than Sisters. I didn't get a lot of Sisters. A little bit in the voice, but that's just because It's standard baritone goth singer voice, though not doing the goth singer voice necessarily that I always complain about. It wasn't that forced voice so much. They had the right timbre, but there was enough emotion in it that made it feel natural rather than being that sort of drony single note. Because I'm trying to do this voice, I can't emote properly because it's so artificial. So it didn't have that. It was a properly emotive voice, but had that deep baritone timbre that was really nice and comforting to listen to for those of us who enjoy our deep voiced male singers. So I did really enjoy that. I enjoyed some of the callbacks to other bands. I particularly liked the as they put in their description, what was it again? Their whatever they said, their idiosyncratic drum beats. I did think the drum work was interesting. It reminded me primarily of Susie and the Banshees, and Budgie's an amazing drummer and had some great drum beats that were rock, but meeting some tribal elements. And just, there was more than just that standard backbeat. Yeah. That, of course, the Sisters template is using a drum machine anyways. Though we shouldn't dehumanize Dr. Avalanche too much. But it had more of that expressiveness, more variety, a lot more like the Susie and the Banshee style, which I've really enjoyed. Susie's, one of my favorite bands, and I do love Budgie's work on the kit for that. I also found, they did a good job of putting that melodic bass line at the fore as is proper post-punk styling, but not over the top, and it had plenty of the jangly, sparkly, swirling guitars that are one of those goth hallmarks. When you called it sort of lounge goth, I mean, my mind went to a totally different way, because I'm still hugely stuck in the lounge revival of the 90s that I love, because I love the old 40s and 50s lounge exotica style music that was very sort of experimental with weird sound effects and stereo effects and novelty things. And I really enjoy that, especially around, I don't know who's seen the movie Four Rooms, but that kind of really gave me my love, the soundtrack of that, which I'm of course blanking on the name of the band, but they were one of the lounge revival bands that were popular, and definitely did that sort of quirky 50s lounge revival thing that, I really enjoy. Especially when it's mixed with a little bit of darkness. You get a little bit of the loungy stuff with sort of your dark spaghetti western surf guitar thing. That sort of mix that you get is really one of those things that I really enjoy in some of the novelty music. So I was kind of like, I don't really hear that, and I do enjoy a good lounge cover of things.
Now that you make that point, I wasn't making that connection just because I had completely forgotten about lounge music in general. I was more thinking just elaboration. Your elaboration helped. I'd say more like a down tempo thing. Yeah, there you go. Than the lounge or the chill out room. God, it's been lo-fi beats to study to. Oh yeah, if you want to get all modern. But I kind of view that as sort of the Cure's domain, is kind of the more soothing. I think you were maybe going on the dirgy a little bit with the Cure, where I do see them more sort of as a soothing gothic rock, but a little bit more laid back than the more, Sisters trying to be a hard rock band. Which was more driving and straightforward, and all of the clones tended to go in that direction, where bands like the Cure took that into a sort of they took it down a couple of notches. They gave it more ambiance, a little bit more atmosphere, a little bit more feeling, rather than just trying to go on the rock train. So I kind of felt they had a very sort of a similar sense of ambiance to the Cure, without going too much down the sort of dirgy thing that the Cure can go towards frequently. I think you were maybe thinking of when you mentioned the dirgy thing. Where I do oftentimes view the Cure as one of the more sort of laid back of the gothic rock artists in the 90s, before you go full on chill out in the 4AD catalog. So staying within the rock domain, but a little bit slower, a little more atmospheric, a little more moody.
pulling away from some of the punk aspects that can thread through a lot of gothic rock, and especially the post-punk side of things. And I did enjoy that. I thought it did have a good feeling. It created a good atmosphere. It flowed really well. I enjoyed the sequencing. As I said earlier, when we were kind of picking what song to play, the whole album kind of flows. So there wasn't really standout tracks to me of this is a great track, this is not so good. I enjoyed elements of something like, oh, this goes into an interesting bass line here, or that's an interesting drum shift, or oh, that's a really good guitar tone, or I really like how the singer's emoting more in this, and you hear some passion, a little bit of cracking in the voice, a little breaking as there's an emotional yelp coming out of an expression rather than just the droning baritone voice. So I did like a lot of that, and I did enjoy the difference in hearing the Portuguese language and some of the feel, which is very different from. I think it has a very different feel from a lot of the other Romance languages, even though it is from a similar basis. It doesn't sound like Italian and Spanish, which always they tend to sound very similar to me. It almost had a bit of to me, it had which was strange, a bit of an Eastern European feel for some reason. Maybe it's because I've been listening to a lot of the sort of Russian or Ukrainian bands, and we've done a few of those on past episodes too. There was a bit of how the cadence and the way the words were put together that made me feel a little bit about that, which I didn't really expect. But I thought it was very interesting. So yeah, I really enjoyed the album. I thought it was enjoyable and comfortable. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, as you said. It wasn't anything that really tweaked my, ooh, this is new and different, and I've never heard this before. But that's harder and harder as I listen to more and more music. I seek too much things that are just out there and weird and quirky that surprising me is sometimes difficult, but it wasn't derivative. It was sort of forging its own path down a bit of a comfortable lane, but not too much that I'm like, oh, I'd rather just listen to favorites that I grew up with in the 90s and 80s. So yeah, I definitely recommend the album. I'd easily put it at 3.5, maybe even verging up to a 4 on the 5 scale for me. But yeah, it was good. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I had to mute myself because my cat was hawking up a fur ball in the background, so that was happening.
Was your cat the source of the purring earlier too?
Yeah. Oh, she's in here. She's making all kinds of noise now. She was quiet.
I definitely heard some purring earlier on.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like during the regular episode. I definitely heard the purring, which was actually very endearing. I enjoyed that.
Well, yeah, and sadly, it's not going to be in the episode because I put a noise gate on the audio, so that's probably going to be below the threshold, and people aren't going to hear it. But maybe I don't know. I'll see if I can do some editing and keep it in, but probably it's not going to be in there.
There are lots of purring samples online. You can just put it back in.
That's true.
Or just do some post-production. Just, is this Luna?
Yeah. No, this is Whiskey.
Oh, Whiskey. Okay. Just go ahead and record Whiskey later.
Yeah, I could.
I'm sure you've got plenty of ability or plenty of opportunity to record.
I could. Yeah.
Purring from your cat or any other of your cats.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up with Sinister Suggestions.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
Well, I was actually not even going to do this because I did not have anything.
I forgot to mention, but I wanted to ask Sanctus if they had any sinister suggestions around books.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it be philosophy or religion or just ideas around death, ways of conceptualizing death, things that inform their perspective on it. I mean, I can definitely do some sinister suggestions around. I already kind of did with Terry Pratchett and Octavia Butler, but I could probably just double down on those.
Yeah, go ahead. I did come up with something to recommend, but I had a lot of trouble thinking of something. I'll
right,
ask
well,
Sanctus in chat and see if they had any. If there is something they want to recommend, I'll put it in the show notes.
yeah, I think that would be great because I know they had already mentioned, things like reading the Quran and things like that, and whether there's just stuff in their reading, whether they've come to it on their own or through their studies when, training to become a death doula, or through interacting with the community of death doulas that inform their attitude towards death, how they approach it with other people, and how they communicate that, would be interesting. Because sometimes, having a story or a book to recommend someone as they're approaching end of life can be really powerful, because having that narrative structure, I think, allows a message to get ingrained more effectively than just telling people what they should think or believe or feel. But yeah, for my sinister suggestion, I guess I'll double down on what I kind of recommended. I mean, I also already said Terry Pratchett is one of my favorite authors. So I would heartily recommend it. If you've never encountered Terry Pratchett in the past, I would highly recommend engaging with some of his works. Of course, they're comedy, or at least they're portrayed as fantasy humor type works, parodying the fantasy subgenre. But especially as he started writing more and more, they deal a lot more with socio-political issues, philosophical issues, and ideas. And to key on our subject here, he's got a whole series of books with death as a main character. It was one of his major and most popular main characters. And so looking at the series of books that focus around death, and that have a lot of great nuggets in my mind of wisdom. In fact, I think both the quotes I made were from books that were part of the death centric lines. But anything in the death, like Reaper Man or the Hogfather, stuff like that focus on the character of death and his immediate surroundings are great to, in a light and humorous way, kind of wrestle with concepts of mortality and death. And then as a second bonus, as I already mentioned, the Earthseed series, starting with The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Great. Well, I mean, it would be dystopian future, except it takes place in 2020, and is not that dissimilar from our dystopian, where there was a presidential candidate who was claiming to make America great again in the book that was written many years before. That became our reality in a conveniently same time frame. But it is sort of a post-apocalyptic, religious and social injustice, gated communities, political wrangling, rises of nationalism. There isn't so much a pandemic, but there are definitely very similar echoes of social strife that we're living through right now. Yeah. So it's interesting to see a book that was written, I don't even remember. I think it was probably in the 80s. I think it's the 90s. I think it was written in the 90s. But I'm not 100% certain, but certainly well before our present time. Yeah, The Parable of the Sower is the first one, and I do recommend that. And their Earthseed religion, I think, is very engaging and an interesting way of looking at our existence here on this transitory planet.
Fantastic suggestion. Yeah, I think you've even mentioned those to me before. But yeah, that's
definitely recommended Terry Pratchett before.
Something I'll try and make time for. I was going to give up and say, hey, I enjoyed playing Halo Infinite for like 2 hours last week. So maybe go do that. It's free. But my sinister suggestion is, I don't even know if I'm supposed to talk about this, but no one told me explicitly not to. And since we are going on hiatus for a month, as we do at the end of the year, I may as well bring this up now, because it should be coming out shortly after this episode releases, I think. But that recommendation would be everyone pick up the winter edition of Auxiliary Magazine, because unless something changes between now and then, it should have an interview with myself in there. It is an edited version of the interview I did, because that ended up being like a 14-page Google Doc, which I think was an fantastic interview, but they are going to cut it down. So I don't know who knows how that's going to turn out in the actual final edit of what's published. But I did a photo shoot with a friend of mine who is a photographer. You can look them up at Candid Fox Photography on Facebook. So that was a lot of fun to get to do that. I was really happy with the way the interview went, at least the pre-edit interview. As I've said on this podcast before, subcultural media, in a large part, print magazines kind of sustained me through high school and sort of were formative in my introduction to goth and alternative culture. And I was constantly trying to find new goth magazines to read as my window into the world that I was in large part kept away from for a long time. And so because that was so foundational to me and had such a profound impact on my life as this sort of incredible new thing that I was really excited about, in some way, this podcast exists as a tribute to that impact, in the hopes that it could, in some small way, be a similar thing for someone else. So having my own interview in the biggest alternative magazine I know of is a huge deal for me personally, and one of the coolest things that's happened to me. Last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, I was asked to write a short article in Unobscured, the Obscura Undead zine, and that was a really special moment for me as well. But now getting to have an interview in what's essentially the new Gothic Beauty magazine, because there is no real corollary for that now that that magazine doesn't exist, is something really cool. So if you want to, when it comes out, go grab a copy, and in 20 years, it can be this cool reference to our chapter in goth history. At least for me, it will be. So that's my suggestion.
Was that the interview you mentioned to me a few months back?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Glad to see that one coming out. That sounded like a really good interview. So
I worked really hard on it, and I wasn't even sure if it was going to be in the magazine. Initially, it was presented to me as something for the website. And so I was really excited when they did actually say, like, yeah, it's going to be in the winter issue.
Yeah, that's cool. That's going to be in the print magazine as well as on the webpage.
Yeah. So that'll be nice. That will bring us to the end of this episode. Now, I did mention that we are, as always, taking a hiatus until next year. So for January, there will not be a new episode. As much as I every year desire to put out another episode, to be honest, this year was the most I've ever struggled with continuing to create the podcast. We started off doing a lot of Patreon content, and that tapered off pretty quickly. And throughout most of the year, I barely had the energy to even just do the mainline podcast, much less any of the bonus content on Patreon or like the YouTube video I did a month ago. So this rest is going to be much, much needed. Considering the reflective nature of this episode, I would like to say that I'm incredibly proud of the content we've made and the conversations we've had this year. I know I say this every year, but I think we've produced some of the best episodes in the history of Cemetery Confessions. And I think in a way I could be content ending the show and letting that sit as the legacy of Cemetery Confessions. I'm not going to do that, at least that's not my intention. And we continue on in large part due to the support we receive on Patreon that I am incredibly grateful for. I do think if that support had not been there, this show would have ended this year. I'm pretty confident in saying that. I am looking forward to finding some more work-life balance, if that's at all possible next year, finding some peace and rest, hopefully. So we won't be relegating the podcast to the sands of time yet. And I also think the medium itself lends well to being conversational and evolving over time. to some degree, in the early days of planning the start of this podcast, I thought that I could create a show that would just answer every existential goth debate in an episode and then call it a day and just point people back to, here's the episode on goth clothing, here's the episode on what is goth, that kind of thing. Thankfully, I grew out of that naivete, and the show evolved into something much more dynamic and meaningful and decentered from myself and my own opinions. So I really do look forward to continuing that conversation between you and I into the future. So if you are interested in more content, you can join Patreon and see what kind of stuff is there. There is a backlog of things to enjoy if you haven't been on, such as our Gothquisition movie commentary tracks, some videos I've done, I've done like day in the life videos. I've done videos of me going out to a local club night. I've done conversational videos sort of in the style of the videos I post on YouTube, sort of discussing a specific topic, that kind of thing. There's other stuff you can get on there as well. And then if you don't want to wait for content, most months I publish the episodes early for Patreon. I'll have at least one video for Patreon next month talking about what the plans for 2022 are for the podcast. So you will get a little extra content coming out in the future. Hopefully now, as work is slowing down a bit for me, I can sort of collect myself physically and emotionally to get some rest and start putting out some new things on Patreon as well. So if you want to check that out, head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions. I really appreciate each and every one of you. And until next year, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.